Hey, so this is going to kind of be a rushed chapter. 7 is not that long, but to be honest, I literally just got home from being on the road. But I wanted to make sure I get more consistent with getting through this book so that I could be able to make more reading spaces with different books. So I'm going to just read through this and just as a disclaimer. So this is just a recorded space where I'm reading chapters out of the book called The Color of Law by this cracker named Richard Rothstein. And the reason why I'm making these spaces is just so anybody can have more access to these books. Sometimes we don't have time, especially under a system of capitalism that keeps exploiting us and steals our time. We don't have time to read the books that can inform us and lead to our liberation. So I just want to do my part in making it more accessible so that you could just hit play and get the book. Another disclaimer, I don't read it all the way through because as I start reading these books, I get into it. So you're gonna hear some commentary, but I'm gonna try to keep it really limited. Again, it's just gonna be one chapter, which is 7. And I just got home, so excuse me for rushing through it, but here we go. So again, reading The Color of Law. This is chapter 7, IRS support and compliant regulators. As public housing packed African Americans into urban projects and federal loan insurance subsidized white families to disperse into single family suburban homes, other racial policies of federal, state, and local governments contributed to and reinforced the segregation of metropolitan areas. Real quick, that's real important. So when they talk about the building of houses, just in case people missed the first 6 chapters, where we're at is Rothenstein is describing how segregation was put in place where racial segregation did not exist before. And that it was put in place because it was a direct response to the war that was happening and the needing to fulfill jobs for factory workers and other industrial working jobs. So what happened was there wasn't enough crackers to hire, so then they started having to use Black people from the South. And hiring Black people from the South, it wasn't just enough to pay them less to work twice as hard in these factories. They also had to make sure they planned their cities in a way to keep them further from the jobs and also to put them in worse housing, all because they did not want them to lead the exploited class. They didn't want them to rise up in class status. They wanted to keep them in perpetual servitude. So that is why they structured housing in this way. And that's what we're reading about in this book. So when they talk about how African Americans into urban projects, what they're talking about is rundown homes on purpose built so they can only last temporarily. And then they put crackers in like more sturdy homes for permanent housing. So I'm going to read on. One was the willingness of the Internal Revenue Service to grant tax exempt status to churches, hospitals, universities, neighborhood associations, and other groups that promoted residential segregation. Again, another arm of the state helping to reinforce segregation. Another was the complicity of regulatory agencies in the discriminatory actions of the insurance companies and banks they supervise. The color of law does not argue that merely because government regulators or regulates a private business, the firm's activities become state action. If the discriminatory constitute de jure segregation, such a claim would eliminate the distinction between the public and private spheres and be amicable to a free democratic society. But because of slavery's legacy, the Constitution gives African Americans a special degree of protection, which is a whole lie. But let's keep going. The 3 constitutional amendments, 13, 14, and 15, adopted after the Civil War, were specifically intended to ensure that African Americans had equal status. And like we read through chapter 4 and 6, they literally disregarded every law or provision that was fought for by Black people. Once they would get it in law, they would say, we're not following that. And there was no enforcement of these laws. So segregation moved on without, of course, any help or protection from the state. That's very important to remember. When government regulation is so intrusive that it blesses systemic racial exclusion, regulators violate their constitutional responsibilities and contribute to de jure segregation. Real estate brokers don't become government agents simply by dint of their state licensure, but when state real estate commissions license members of local and national real estate boards whose public codes of ethics mandate discrimination, acts to establish de jure segregation were committed. So basically how that says, the reason why I keep stopping is because the way this book is worded sometimes is confusing. Basically what they just said is that real estate brokers who would be considered, private sector workers, they don't, that job isn't like necessarily an arm of the state. But what happens is they become deputized, right? When they reinforce segregation, on behalf of the state for white supremacy to continue to exploit blacks. So you could be a real estate worker, right? Or any kind of worker if you think about it. And if your job results in the further marginalizing of black people, well, guess what? You've just been deputized by the state. And again, white people will call you a white supremacist. So anyways, similarly, universities, churches, and other nonprofit institutions cannot be considered state actors simply by dint of their tax exempts. But we have a right to expect the IRS to have been especially vigilant and to have withheld tax exempt status when the promotion of segregation by nonprofit institution was blatant, explicit, and influential. The IRS has always had an obligation to withhold tax favoritism from discriminatory organizations, but it almost never acted to do so. Its regulations specifically authorize charitable deductions from an organization that eliminate prejudice and discrimination and defend human and civil rights secured by law. Real quick. So again, this is a cracker who wrote this book. So he writes this book saying like, well, guys, the government and the laws, they're supposed to protect us. That's his point of view, right? Understand that my point of view is that no, it's not. It's a white supremacist system that is a white settler colony, and we live in an open air prison. So the reason why we live like this is not by accident. It's not benign neglect. It's intentional. This is exactly the way the system is supposed to work, and that's exactly why the system was built and continues to be modified and updated to continue to work this way. So just so you know, so when you hear certain passive language, this is from the perspective of a cracker in academia. That's really important. The IRS leadership recognized this in 1967 when the agency exercised its authority to withhold the tax exemption of a recreational facility that excluded African Americans. See, he just described the IRS and read like their credo about, oh, we're upholding human rights. That's what we're here for, right? And yet in its actions, and if you look at the direct result, it literally reinforced segregation by giving tax exempt status to nonprofits and organizations that actively discriminated against African Americans. See, and that's why when we sit there and we say like, oh, well, you're saying this institution is racist, but it's not saying it's racist. Y'all, we have to be more discerning and just look at your material conditions. Yet until 1970, 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the IRS granted tax exempt to private white-only academies that have been established throughout the South to evade the ruling. It rejected the exemptions only in response to a court injunction won by civil rights groups. I know I keep stopping a lot, but I also want us to try to hold like a lot of different ideas at one time when we read these books. And one of the ideas we have to read is, yes, all this shit was imposed upon us as Black people, as oppressed people, but also during these times, Black people fought, strategized in many different ways, and which is why we're still here today. That's very important. Like literally a whole system designed to oppress the people, and that people are here today because they were strategists, because they were fighters, because they believed that we could make it, there is something worth fighting for, and they did. So even though they didn't defeat the system, yes, we're still enslaved, we're still oppressed, but the day is possible because these people fought back. So yes, I love saying I'm like my ancestors because they're fighters. In 1976, the IRS denied the tax exemption of Bob Jones University because the school would not allow interracial dating by its students. The university mounted a court challenge to the IRS action, and when the case reached the Supreme Court, the Reagan administration refused to defend the agency, so the Supreme Court appointed an outside lawyer, William T. Coleman Jr., to make the argument that the government itself should have presented. Coleman's brief asserted, indeed, if the charitable organization provision of the IRS code were construed to permit tax exemptions for racially discriminatory schools, the provision would be unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment. The government has an affirmative constitutional duty to steer clear of providing significant aid to such schools. In its widely noticed 1983 decision, the court upheld the IRS decision and concluded that an institution seeking tax exempt status must serve a public purpose and not be contrary to established public policy. So that part's important. So let me just describe what I just read. So what happened was, right, they were being sued for racial discrimination, right? They weren't giving funds to a school. So what happened was the lawyer who actually, had the correct argument, right, according to the quote unquote laws, right, said that, hey, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. You are literally violating human rights. But the court took an opposite position and said, hey, well, this is already established. This is already the norm. We can't tell a private sector to go against the already established norm. And remember, chapter 1 and 3 also described how when they were creating segregation, one part of the propaganda to establishing segregation was saying this is for the public good. So now further down the line, when they tried to reverse, like when people would fight against it to get segregation overturned, one of the ways in which they argued to keep it was say, hey, you can't get rid of it because this is part of the public good. Y'all, it's so important to know this history because when you understand and you learn this stuff, you understand the only logical conclusion is revolution. Let me continue. I apologize. I'm going to try to control myself and not cut in so much so that I can get to the chapter. Okay. It did not adopt Coleman's constitutional argument to make its case, but neither did the court reject it. In his opinion, Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote that many of those who submitted briefs in the case, including Coleman, argued that denial of tax-exempt status to racially discriminatory schools is independently required by the equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment. In light of our resolution of this litigation, we do not reach that issue, but Coleman's argument was solid, and it implicitly condemned the decades-long passivity of the IRS by confronting how its tax-exempt policy strengthened residential segregation. See, to me, that's not passive. If you're strengthening a white supremacist like policy, that's intentional. That's not something that you're passively doing. But again, keep in mind who wrote the book. Support for a ban on interracial dating certainly offended the Constitution, but its national policy significance was trivial in comparison to the IRS silence when nonprofit institutions promoted restrictive covenants or engaged in other activities to prevent African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods. Just real quick, when we talk about African Americans moving into white neighborhoods, there has been a campaign of misinformation when it comes to segregation and integration in which people have been just shitting on history basically and saying like, oh, Black people just wanted to be next to white people. This is why books like this are important and that we learn the facts. So again, as the early in the chapter is stated, it wasn't about moving next to crackers. It was about shitty housing only being allowed to Black people, right? They were only allowed to purchase, and again, few shitty houses. So think if you have a city or an area, right, in which you're trying to move to get closer to your jobs because that's where the jobs are at. They're telling you, well, oh, we built 100 houses for workers to work in this factory. Only 6 of them are going to be allowed to African Americans. But we're hiring all of y'all at lower rates. So guess what they have to do with those 6 houses that they're allowed to go to? 6 shitty houses. Again, fucked up plumbing, shoddily built, not really resistance against the elements, and they paid 3 times more than what white people were paying for permanent housing, to better housing that had playgrounds and grass and, like I said, scenery and also community centers and all of that shit. So when they word it in a way that, oh, you weren't allowed to live next to white people, no, replace that in your minds and be discerning. Say, no, we weren't allowed to get access to the resources to proper housing that we are owed and already worked for and paid for through our taxes. They are literally taking their taxes to build up white neighborhoods to make them better and telling you can't have access to what you paid for. That's what that is saying. Not living next to crackers. Don't shit on our ancestors like that. But Coleman's argument was solid. I'm sorry. Churches, synagogues, and their clergy frequently led such efforts. That's important. Segregation wasn't just the state, like all institutions within this community helped make this possible. And then it also was adopted culturally. And then also individual crackers, regardless of their class status, were also deputized to help reinforce this. We read in chapter 3 how a cracker who can't even, can be in a fucked up situation, exploited on their job, can see a black family move in and sue that black family for moving in. And that black family would then have to be evicted. So while the state robs a cracker of its power by exploiting them and their labor, they would then also turn around and, rob black people of their power and their humanity. Just sick shit on behalf of the state. Churches, synagogues, and their clergy frequently led such efforts. Shelley versus Kramer, the 1948 Supreme Court ruling that ended court enforcement of restrictive covenants, offer a conspicuous illustration. The case stemmed from objections of white St. Louis homeowners, Louis and Fern Kramer, to purchase of a house in their neighborhood by African Americans, J.D. and Ethel Shelley. The area had been covered by a restrictive covenant organized by a white owners group, the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association, which was sponsored by the Cote Brilliant Presbyterian Church. Trustees of the church provided funds from the church treasury to finance the Kramer's lawsuit to have the African American family evicted. Do y'all hear that shit? A place that, quote unquote, is built for praising the Lord, getting funds from other poor ass crackers, right, are giving their tithe to hopefully buy their ticket into heaven, right? Use that tithe to evict a black family, and these crackers still think they're going to heaven. I swear to God. If there's a heaven for crackers, I will happily go to hell. Let me tell you that. Anyways, moving on. Another nearby church, the Wagner Place Methodist Episcopal Church South, was also a signatory to the restrictive covenant. Its pastor had defended the clause in a 1943 legal case arising from the purchase of a nearby house by Scoville Richardson, a distinguished attorney who later became one of the first African Americans nationwide appointed to the federal judiciary. Such church involvement and leadership were commonplace in property owners associations that were organized to maintain neighborhood segregation. Also, too, that's really important. So they talk about that black person status, like there's this lawyer to note, or I would take from it about, me reading this. It's like, damn, remember that Chris Rock joke in his stand-up where he talked about like Jay-Z, Mary J. Blige, two of the most influential people within music, not just black music, period, worldwide. And they live next to a dentist, an au fait dentist. Like that's what we're describing here. Like they're pointing out that, this wasn't just, not that it matters, but just for conversation, right? Or just for understanding. It's not that they're talking about like any black person could move in. Even the black people who had like rose into status, who have quote unquote prestigious jobs, couldn't even live next to a cracker who worked in a factory. And that cracker who worked in a factory can get that lawyer evicted. That pastor can get that family evicted. That, churches would literally crowdfund to get black people out of neighborhoods and kept out of access to adequate housing, and then talk about praise the Lord. Hypocrisy. Such church involvement and leadership were commonplace in property owners associations that were organized to maintain neighborhood segregation. In North Philadelphia in 1942, a priest spearheaded a campaign to prevent African Americans from living in a neighborhood. Whew. Let me keep reading because y'all, I'm just going to keep getting mad. The same year, a priest, and we should. I'm not saying we should. We definitely should, but I want y'all to be able to soak all this up without hearing me, talking about burn this bitch down, which again, we should. The same year, a priest in a Polish American parish in Buffalo, New York, directed the campaign to deny public housing for African American war workers, stalling a proposed project for 2 years. Just south of the city, 600 units in the federally managed project for whites went vacant, while Africans, war workers, could not find adequate housing. In Los Angeles, the Reverend W. Clarence Wright, pastor of the fashionable Wilshire Presbyterian Church, led efforts to keep the Wilshire district all white. He personally sued to evict an African-American war veteran who had moved into the restricted area in 1947. Wright lost the case, one of the few times before Shelley in which a state court held covenants to be unconstitutional. In a widely publicized ruling, the judge said that there was no more reprehensible un-American activity than to attempt to deprive persons of their own homes on a master race theory. Yet the IRS took no notice. Reverend Wright's activities didn't threaten the church's tax subsidy. Y'all, I hope we see revolution in my lifetime. Mm. The violent resistance to the Sojourner Truth Public Housing Project for African American families in Detroit was organized by a homeowners association headquartered in St. Louis, the King Catholic Church, whose pastor, the Reverend Constantine Zink, represented the association in appeals to the United States Housing Authority to cancel the project. The construction of a low-cost housing project in the vicinity for the colored people would mean utter ruin for many people who have mortgaged their homes to the FHA. And not only that, but it would jeopardize the safety of many of our white girls. This was a quote from a goddamn reverend. Reverend Zink wrote, adding this warning: "It is a sentiment of all people residing within the vicinity to object against this project in order to stop race riots in the future." There needs to be more spaces of us talking about religion's role in not only creating segregation, but also its role in white supremacy globally. Like, I know we talk about missionaries and things like that, but also too, just in these ways too. And then how they're giving covering because they're like, oh, they're the cloth, the white supremacy. Like, come on, we got to start holding all these crackers responsible, and also look at their actions. Like, their words his words were blunt, but at the same time, again, he would go to his church and preach salvation, talk the word of Jesus Christ. Y'all, look up liberation theology and the way in which they tell the story of Jesus and repurpose it, or just tell it in a more way that is beneficial to us. Like, if you look at the actions of these pastors keeping Black people out of housing, a human right, there is no way in which, if let's just say hypothetically, if Jesus were to return, these crackers would literally organize to make sure he did not have housing. Like, and but yet would put themselves as the face of like pure Christianity, or like, some people who are spiritual or connected to divine or whatever the fuck. But yeah, anyway, religion under white supremacy is still white supremacy in my thing. And this is an example of how. On Chicago's South Side, signatures on a 28 restrictive covenant were obtained in a door-to-door solicitations by priests of St. Elslam Catholic Church, the rabbi of Congregation Beth Jacob, and the executive director of the area's Property Owners Association. That's really important that they name the names of these reverends and pastors and clergy people and their churches and where they are, because I guarantee you, if y'all look up some of the names I mentioned, they're still there. And if you look at their ties to politicians in your area, you will see a lot of them fund far right evangelicals and how they keep the system of white supremacy going. So what I'm saying is that these names and churches that I'm reading literally still function the same today. So no, this is not the past. They're literally describing the present. So let's see. In 1946, the Congregational Church of Park Manor sponsored a local improvement association's efforts to cancel an African-American physician's home purchase in the previously all-white neighborhood. In Chicago's near North Side, a restrictive covenant was executed in 1937 by tax-exempt religious institutions, including the Moody Bible Institute, the Louisville Presbyterian. Is that how y'all say it? Also, disclaimer, my dyslexic ass is going to mispronounce a lot of words. I always mispronounce Ofe's names, but for other stuff, it's because I think I'm dyslexic. The Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the Board of Foreign Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church, other nonprofit organizations also participated, including the Newberry Library and the Academy of Fine Arts. Y'all, libraries and academies teaching like how to play instruments helped solidify and spread and reinforce segregation. Tax-exempt colleges and universities, some religious affiliated and some not, also were active in promoting segregation. And that's important too, because when you hear protests at colleges and these other institutions and people like, why are you bringing up old shit? They're not. They owe y'all Black people. Literally, they are institutions that enacted these systems that we still are oppressed by today. Honestly, I just think a lot of people we should start talking about general strikes more. And that's not just not going to work. It's also storming these institutions. I would love to hear about people storming universities and shit and taking everything off the walls, taking chairs, couches, everything. Like, all that shit is owed to the people. But whew, y'all, I get fired up. All right. Other nonprofit organizations also participated, including Newberry Library and Academy of Fine Arts. Tax-exempt colleges and universities, some religious affiliated and some not, were also active in promoting segregation. In Whittier, a Los Angeles suburb, a Quaker-affiliated Whittier College participated in a restrictive covenant covering its neighborhood. Those crackers were in the middle of fucking nowhere. And we're like, I just want to make sure I don't see not one Black family. That is crazy. Again, and then going to church on Sunday, preaching love and Christ's love. The University of Chicago organized and guided property owners associations that were devoted to preventing Black families from moving nearby. So just in case I read that too fast, the University of Chicago organized and guided property owners. Guided meaning like they literally, it's not going to say it in this book, but they literally held like training classes in their classrooms on how you could prevent, you, an ordinary citizen, can prevent Black people from moving in. Associations that were devoted to preventing Black families and from moving nearby. And again, the funds they were getting from the government were Black people's taxes because Black people paid taxes and in most times paid more. The university not only subsidized the association, but from 1933 to 1947, spent $100,000 on legal services to defend covenants and evict African Americans who had arrived in this neighborhood. When criticized for these activities, University of Chicago president Robert Maynard Hutchins wrote in 1937 that the university must endeavor to stabilize this neighborhood as an area in which its students and faculty will be covenant to live. So real quick, so these crackers would justify this saying, we're just trying to protect our neighborhood. And if we read, if a person was to read this book today, because of our indoctrination, would be like, oh, well, they just don't want crime. Remember, they told us Chicago has a lot of crime. No, remember, go back to chapter 3 and 4, and it explicitly maps out and states that integrating neighborhoods actually helped market values, not hurt. And crime only was high in areas that they did not have access to resources. Once people had access to resources, crime dropped. So these crackers are lying. Do not buy into that shit. So when you read these books, be very discerning and understand we're all indoctrinated, which also it affects the way we interpret information. So you have to read very intentionally for your liberation. And then that takes practice. When criticized for these activities, University of Chicago, there we go. And that, therefore, the university had the right to invoke and defend restrictive covenants in the surrounding areas. Insurance companies also participated in segregation. They have large reserve funds to invest, and because they are heavily regulated, state policymakers are frequently involved in plans for any housing projects that insurers propose. In 1938, when Frederick Ecker, president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, wanted to build the 12,000-unit Parkchester Apartments in New York City, he could not proceed without an amendment to the state's insurance code permitting insurers to invest in low-rent housing. The state legislature adopted the amendment, fully aware that it was authorizing a project from which African Americans would be excluded. After Parkchester was completed in 1942, Metropolitan Life embarked on a new project, the 9,000-unit Stuyvesant Town housing complex on the east side of Manhattan. For the development, New York City condemned and cleared 18 square city blocks and transferred the property to the insurance company. Y'all hear that shit? God damn. Evil and corrupt, morally bankrupt. And we're trying to negotiate with this system, saying this system that did this, we haven't even scratched the surface, y'all. This system that did and continues to do these things, we're saying we can negotiate and reform. All right. The city also granted Metropolitan Life a 25-year tax abatement, whose value meant that far more public than private money was invested in the project. The subsidies were granted despite Metropolitan's Life announcement that, like Parkchester, the project would be for white people only. Ecker advised the New York City Board of Estimate that Negroes and whites don't mix. If we brought them into this development, it would depress all of the surrounding property. Again, that's a lie, and it was already shown that it's a lie. But then what's really important is I want to say in chapter 1, it talked about how the president at that time in the 1930s was saying how we need to make sure, and it's not just the president, it's politicians, period. We're saying we need to make sure that crackers, right, invest in capitalism. And they said because we need to make sure that communism doesn't spread. By making sure communism doesn't spread, we need them to invest in a capitalist system. That's a quote. That literally what it said. And it said that's why it started issuing the propaganda is that you need to own land and homes. Ownership became important. And so they would sell to crackers to say, hey, you own this. So you have a direct stake in the system continuing. And part of having a stake in the system continuing, you need to make sure these Black folks don't get out of line or try to exceed their class status, because then that's a direct threat to you, because then they're going to take bread off your table, housing from you, food off your plate. So that's how they sold. And that's really important because we see this message recycled over and over. There's constantly not a new target, but expanding targets, right? So now, like, for instance, since we're on Twitter, FBA, they literally have these talking points that the immigrants are taking our jobs and taking our food. Again, that is when you align with that shit, you are aligning with white supremacy. Let's see. Edgar advised the New York City Board of Estimate that Negroes and whites don't mix. If we brought them into this development, it would depress all the surrounding property. Because of the project's refusal to accept African Americans, the board was divided whether to allow it to proceed. It eventually paired its approval with an ordinance forbidding racial segregation in any subsequent developments for which the city had to engage in slum clearance. In response to the public protest against this policy of excluding African Americans from Stuyvesant Town, Metropolitan Life built the Riverton Houses, a smaller development for African Americans in Harlem. Abiding by the new ordinance, the project was open to whites, but in practice, it rented most exclusively to African American families. In 1947, a New York State court rejected a challenge to Stuyvesant Town's racial exclusion policy. The decision was upheld on appeal in 1949. The Supreme Court declined review. The following year, the New York State legislature enacted a statute prohibiting racial discrimination in any housing that receives state aid in a form of tax exemption, sale of land below cost, or land obtained through condemnation. Now, remember, these things happening, the court coming to these conclusions, wasn't on their own. It wasn't a change of heart. At the same time, Black people are literally protesting, staging boycotts of certain products, of certain companies, doing worker strikes, picketing, all kind of shit. Shit is happening simultaneously. So that's why you'll see concessions in times of unrest, because they're like, oh shit, they're fed up. Let's give them a few concessions and maybe they'll calm down. And then we can keep business as usual while we're giving them concessions. It is why I argue that if we really want liberation, the only conclusion is revolution. The same year, Metropolitan Life finally agreed to lease some apartments to Stuyvesant Town to qualified Negro tenants. But by then, the development was filled. New York City's rent control laws, by which existing tenants pay significantly less than market rate rents, helped to ensure that turnover would be slow. Rapidly rising rents in apartments that had been vacated made the development increasingly unaffordable to middle-income families. These conditions combined to make the initial segregation of Stuyvesant Town nearly permanent. By the 2010 census, only 4% of Stuyvesant Town residents were African American. In a New York metropolitan area, that was 15% African American. That's important because remember, we just read in the previous paragraph, they said, oh, it's illegal to not rent to African Americans. So people would read that and be like, oh, that means African Americans moved in. No. Usually when they give us a concession, it's because they already understand that they have done the work to make it permanent, that they no longer have to supervise. It would basically be a self-operating machine. So that's why we can't get comfortable in words and platitudes. If our material conditions are showing us we're still oppressed, well, God damn it, I don't give a fuck if they admit that they're oppressing us. They are still our oppressors, and they deserve the wall. As in so many other instances, the low-income neighborhood that the city raised to make way for Stuyvesant Town have been integrated and stable. About 40% of those evictions were African American or Puerto Rican, and many of them had no alternative but to move to racially isolated communities elsewhere in the city and beyond. Although New York ceased to allow future discrimination in public subsidized projects, it made no effort to remediate the segregation it had already created. Even when mortgage loans were not insured by the FHA or the VA, banks and savings institutions pursued discriminatory policies. Banks and thrifts, however, are private institutions. Can it fairly be said that the discriminatory lending activities contributed to de jure segregation? I think so. Government deposit insurance programs underwrite bank and thrift institution profits. In return, there is extensive oversight of lending practices. Examiners from the Federal Reserve, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is the FDIC, and the Office of Thrift Supervision all have regularly reviewed loan applications and other financial records of banks and savings and loan offices to ensure that lending practices were sound. Banks and thrifts were able to refuse service to African Americans only because, until recently, federal and state regulators chose to allow it. So when they act like, oh no, these little individuals in this town were doing it, no, it's systemic. And even the boards or the organizations that were put in charge of overseeing, these banks and institutions, they oversaw to make sure that they stayed segregated. So yeah, I don't give a fuck. And this is kind of sidetracking. If I see people run into Walmart and steal every fucking thing, I hope y'all make it a common practice. I hope anytime someone's like, oh, I got to go to the store, you go to steal, because everything, and I do mean everything without exception, belongs to the people. The Federal Home Loan Bank Board, for example, chartered and insured and regulated Savings and Loans Association from the early years of the New Deal, but did not oppose the denial of mortgages to African Americans until 1961. It did not enforce the new race-blind policy, however, perhaps because it was in conflict with the board's insistence that mortgage eligibility account for economic, in quotes, factors. That's really important because as the system updates, its oppressive strategy, it also updates its language. So it might not name the marginalized group that it's intended to oppress. So that means us as the oppressed who are strategizing for our liberation. When we read these things, we have to be more discerning and, again, intentional in what we're looking for in this information. Yes, this book is written by a cracker, but there are facts and dates in here that we can use to understand our current conditions, and that is really important. Like the 1961, it did not enforce the new race-blind policy, however, perhaps because it was conflict with the board's insistence that mortgage eligibility account for economic factors. Like the FHA, it claimed that judging African Americans to be poor credit risk because they were Black was not a racial judgment, but an economic one. Now, remember, they're saying an economic one now. Who did they deny? Lawyers, doctors, other type of physicians and teachers and professors. So you can kiss my ass with that shit. Again, that's why never take what the propaganda says at face value. Again, you hear the words, be discerning, and then look at your material conditions. You have every right to look around you and say, wait a minute, you saying one thing, but it's producing another. Then you have every right as a human being to indict that system with genocide. And you're right in doing so. Remember that. It claimed that judging African Americans to be poor. Oh, as a result, its staff failed. Okay. Its staff failed to remedy the industry's consistent support for segregation. It didn't fail. It successfully implemented segregation. In 1961, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights challenged regulators about their complicity in banks' redlining practices. Ray M. Gidney, then comptroller of the currency responsible for chartering, supervising, regulating, and examining national banks, responded, end quote, our office does not maintain any policy regarding racial discrimination in the making of real estate loans by national banks, which was a lie. FDCI Chairman Earl Koch asserted that it was appropriate, his name would be Koch, I swear to God, crackers, was appropriate for banks under his supervision to deny loans to African Americans because whites' property values might fall if they had Black neighbors. And Federal Reserve Board Chairman William McChesney Martin stated, neither the Federal Reserve nor any other bank supervisor agency has or should have authority to compel officers and directors of any bank to make any loan against their judgment. Martin's view was the federal regulators should only prohibit the approval of unsound loans, not require the non-discriminatory approval of sound loans. If a Black family was denied a loan because of race, Martin asserted, the forces of competition would ensure that another bank would come forward to make the loan. This is the bullshit they feed you to why you should buy into capitalism. Like, oh, well, if you're competitive enough, only the best get, access to the resources, which is not true. It is a lie. what's that cracker's name? Jeff Bezos is not the best. That is a whole mediocre cracker who is just another overseer who exploits workers. So no, it's not a this false narrative, this propaganda that gets shoved down our fucking throats to say, hey, the reason why you're in the circumstances you in, the reason why your housing is shoddy, the reason why we're building houses now in current time to just fall apart so that you have to constantly go to Home Depot and buy expensive stuff to keep it up is because you're just not working hard enough and you're not good enough. And that's a lie. And they tell you that so that you can keep doing this self-improvement when really what you should do is wake up tomorrow and burn the bitch down. But anyway, I apologize, y'all. This shit pisses me the fuck off. With his regulatory authority over all banks that were members of the Federal Reserve System, and with all such banks engaging in similar discriminatory practices, Martin surely knew or should have known that his claim was false. When regulated businesses engage in systemic racial discrimination, when government regulation is intense, and when regulators openly endorse the racial discrimination carried out by the sector they are supervising, then in those cases, the regulators ignore the civil rights they are sworn to uphold and contribute to de jure discrimination. As the Supreme Court once said, referring to banks chartered by the federal government, national banks are instrumentalities of the federal government created for public purpose. So if the banks are instruments of the state and the state is white supremacist state, okay, make the connections, y'all. Like I said, they try to convince us that when we talk about how we're kept down in our lives as oppressed people, they try to say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. No, it's history. And hold on to that. It's gaslighting when they do that shit. Racially discriminatory government activities did not end 50 years ago. On the contrary, some have continued into the 21st century. One of the more troubling has been the regulatory tolerance of banks reversing redlining, excessive marketing of exploitative loans in African American communities. This was an important cause of the 2008 financial collapse because these loans, called subprime mortgages, were bound to go into default. When they did, lower middle class African American neighborhoods were devastated and their residents with their homes foreclosed and were forced back into lower income areas. In the early 2000s, reverse redlining was tolerated, sometimes winked at by bank regulators. Banks, thrift institutions, and mortgage companies designed subprime loans for borrowers who had a higher risk of default, and they charged higher interest payments to subprime borrowers to compensate for that risk. In itself, this was a legitimate practice. But federally regulated banks and other lenders created many subprime loans with conditions that were designed to make repayment difficult. These mortgages had high closing costs and repayment penalties and low initial teaser interest rates that skyrocketed after borrowers were locked in. Some subprime loans also had negative moderation requirements for initial monthly payments that were lower than needed to cover costs, with the difference then added to the outstanding principal. Like real quick, we're given this constant messaging of, okay, y'all, in order for you to be an adult, there's certain milestones you have to hit under capitalism. One of that is to own a home. Like I already gone over why that is. And the thing is, for us as Black people, it is rigged. And how they do it now, like I'll describe in Houston just real quick. So if you go to go get a loan and you get approved and they'll say like, no down payment because you're a first time home buyer, what you'll find in your contract is that within the first year, you'll pay whatever you signed on for. So let's just say a number, say you signed a loan to pay $1,500 a month. Read the fine print and read your contracts, which they know you're not going to do because one, they make it in legalese, so it's hard to even interpret. And then it's 1,000 fucking pages. Who the fuck has time to read all that shit in the smallest handwriting possible or the smallest font possible? And so what happens is if you read these contracts, and I'm a nerd, I read everything. But when I was helping people with housing, I read their contracts and their contracts literally said that after that year, their mortgage can double. So you already like scripting and saving to get a house to make ends meet with $1,500. Well, guess what? After your first year, your mortgage is now $3,000. And that's not just it. We're not talking about lights and utilities and all the other stuff that goes with it. And again, the way housing is made these days is to purposely deteriorate faster. So now you also have to learn how to replace breakers that are going to go out when they shouldn't. They can literally make them last longer, but they don't on purpose. You have to, your foundation is now cracking and sinking. Your backyard is all fucked up. Your plumbing is fucked. All that shit you have to constantly find money for. And then you look at your mortgage statement, and now you're paying double than what you just paid before. And what happens is, and a lot of people don't read this either, if you read the mobile banking apps disclaimers, they can literally freeze your account, restrict access to mobile banking when you fall behind on your mortgage. Y'all, come on. Burn it the fuck down is what I'm trying to tell y'all. Borrowers should have been more careful before accepting loans they could not understand or reasonably pay, but they were victims of a market that was not transparent, in some cases deliberately not so. So how the fuck would an author who knows all this shit still come to these fucking milquetoast conclusions? I can't stand these OFAs. He literally says, oh, you should have known better and, budgeted better. But then also in the next sentence say, oh, well, they didn't tell y'all and they purposely kept it from you. Then how the fuck do you know better? This is what I'm talking about. Read the books with intention for your liberation so that you can get angry at the right parts. It's necessary. For example, mortgage broker compensation systems included incentives to pressure borrowers into accepting subprime mortgages without the brokers disclosing the consequences. Brokers receive bonuses, in effect kickbacks called yield and spread premiums, or YSPs, if they made loans with interest rates higher than those recommended by their bank on formal rate sheets for borrowers with similar characteristics. Regulators and banks that purchased these mortgages from marketers did not require brokers to disclose to borrowers what these rate sheets specified. In 2010, Dodd-Frank Financial Reform and Consumer Protection Act banned YSPs. It took another year for the Federal Reserve to issue a rule implementing the ban. But borrowers who were deceived as a result of the kickback systems are without recourse. Nothing, however, would have prevented the Federal Reserve from banning the practice years earlier. Brokers and loan officers manipulated borrowers by convincing them they could take advantage of perpetually rising equity to refinance their loans before the teaser rates expired and take cash out of their increased equity, with the share left as profit for the lending institution. And that's important because if you go on these YouTube channels with like so-called real estate gurus, they literally tell people to do this. And this is what it does. It is a trap. So we have to ask ourselves, like, why are these people with, YouTube channels, seminars that you have to pay $500 to go sit in, literally telling you to do something that is against your best interest and serves the state and the system? But it happens a lot. But it's because if we don't know better, we could fall for traps just trying to make our living conditions better. So it's not the fault of the oppressed. Don't ever fall for that. The onus and the shame is on the white supremacist institution, always. Brokers and loan officers manipulated borrowers by convincing them that they can take out. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm rereading that. These discriminatory practices were widespread throughout the industry, at least since the late 1990s. The little state or federal regulatory response. Data on lending disparities suggests that the discrimination was based on race, not on economic status. Among homeowners who had refinanced in 2000 as the subprime bubble was expanding, lower income African Americans were more than twice as likely as lower income whites to have subprime loans. And higher income African Americans were about 3 times as likely as higher income whites to have subprime loans. That's really important because there's a conversation to be had when you find yourself in, making $100K a year as someone Black. We always say that, it's not the same as a cracker making $100K because we have family we got to take care of. So that divides our money even more. And then like it expressed here, higher income earners were literally the main targets of subprime loans. So even when you so-called do everything right, you go to school, get your degree and get a good paying job, you are still subject to the conditions that keep you oppressed. That's why as Black people, no matter where we find ourselves in class status, we have to understand we should not have any investment in this system. We're all still enslaved to it, whether you make $1 million, billion, or $100K or nothing. This system has to go. It's killing us. The most extreme case occurred in Buffalo, New York, where 3/4 of all refinance loans to African Americans were subprime. In Chicago, borrowers in predominantly African-American census tracts were 4 times as likely to have subprime loans as borrowers in predominantly white census tracts. In 2000, 41% of all borrowers with subprime loans would have qualified for conventional financing with lower rates, a figure that increased to 61% in 2006. By then, African-American mortgage recipients have subprime loans at 3 times the rate of white borrowers. Higher income African Americans have subprime mortgages at 4 times the rate of higher income whites, even though its own survey in 2005 revealed a similar racial discrepancy. The Federal Reserve did not take action. By failing to curb discrimination that its own data disclosed, the Federal Reserve violated African Americans' legal and constitutional rights. Yes, it violated, but it didn't fail to. Again, the system is working exactly as it intended and exactly the way they built and worked it to intend to work. So this whole passive language of, oh man, they didn't show up. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. No, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. Because remember, these institutions are representatives of the state, and the state is white supremacy and capitalism and other systems of oppression. So in 2010, the Justice Department agreed that the more segregated a community of color is, the more likely it is that homeowners will face foreclosure because the lenders who peddled the most toxic loans targeted these communities. Settling a lawsuit against the Countrywide Mortgage Company, later a subsidiary of the Bank of America, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Sean Donovan remarked that because of Countrywide's and other lenders' practices, from Jamaica, Queens, New York to Oakland, California, strong middle-class African-American neighborhoods saw nearly 2 decades of gains reversed in a matter of not years, but months. Again, that is important because as Black people, we're like, damn, everything is built against us. How can we thrive and still have a family and just be? These crackers would not leave us alone. They literally targeted people who they saw were quote unquote successful under a capitalist system. They was like, yeah, well, the only reason why we treat you like this as subhuman is because you don't walk right, you don't dress right, you don't act right. And these so-called respectability politics that we play to today, we'll sit there and use that as a reason why we're not free and liberated. When they literally tell you in their own laws, in their own history, like, I don't give a fuck how well you dress, how well you talk. You are Black people of African descent. We, under a system of white supremacy, say you will be designated forever into subjectivity. That should get you angry every fucking morning when you wake up. And not only that, but they profit off of millionaires who are right now making whole reality TV shows and showing you their house and their $1 million toilets. Got it off of these systems existing, off of your subjugation. Man, if y'all decide to storm Beverly Hills, understand I'll be right there fucking with you. For those disposed after foreclosures, there has been greater homelessness, more doubling up with relatives, and more apartment rentals and less stable neighborhoods where poor and minority families are more tightly concentrated. In its legal action against Countrywide, the government alleged that the statistical relationship between race and mortgage terms were so extreme that top bank officials must have been aware of the racial motivation. And if top bank officials were aware, so too must have been the government regulators. Indeed, the Justice Department got involved only because Countrywide modified its government charter in 2007 so that the Office of Thrift Supervision assumed responsibility for its regulation from the Federal Reserve Board. The office noticed that racially tinged statistics referred to the lender to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Discriminatory practices had continued for years under the Federal Reserve supervision. Several cities sued banks because of the enormous devastation that the foreclosure crisis imposed on African Americans. A case that the city of Memphis brought against Wells Fargo banks was supported by affidavit of bank employees stating that they referred to subprime loans as ghetto loans. Bank supervisors instructed their marketing staffs to target solicitation to heavily African American zip codes because residents there weren't savvy enough to know that they were being exploited. A sales group sought out elderly African Americans, believing they were particularly susceptible to pressure to take out high-cost loans. Again, remember how this happened. When you're kept out of resources, kept out of adequate housing, and then you're given this illusion of inclusion with a high debt to pay. Of course, people who want better housing are going to go for it. Again, they're being tricked, hoodwinked, bamboozled, as Malcolm X would say. So again, we have to stop blaming ourselves for something that is designed to oppress us. The only thing we need to hold true is that revolution needs to happen in our lifetime to be liberated. Because I would hate for 50 years down the line for our Black, descendants to be reading this book and say, damn, back in the 2000s, it was like that, when it's still like that in their time. Hopefully they'll be reading books of how we overthrew the system so that they can have a better chance at life. A similar suit by the city of Baltimore presented evidence that Wells Fargo established a unit staffed exclusively by African Americans whom supervisors instructed to visit Black churches to market subprime loans. The bank had no similar practice of marketing such loans through white institutions. In 2008, the city of Cleveland sued a large group of subprime lenders, including Citicorp, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and others. The lawsuit alleged that the institution should not have marketed any subprime loans in Cleveland's suppressed Black neighborhoods because the lenders knew that high poverty and unemployment rates and flat property values in those communities would preclude borrowers from capturing sufficient appreciation to afford the higher adjustable rates they face once the initial low teaser rates expired. Cleveland's suit argued that the banks should be held liable for the harm they created, including loss of tax revenues and increase in drug dealing and other crime in neighborhoods with many foreclosed and abandoned buildings. The city charged that the financial firms had created a public nuisance. A federal court dismissed the suit, concluding that because mortgage lending is so heavily regulated by the federal and state governments, there's no question that the subprime lending that occurred in Cleveland was conduct which the law sanctioned. So it brings up drugs and crime. Again, when we read For Our Liberation, we understand who put the drugs in our community. So as well as charging us well over what the housing costs, the housing are inadequate to begin with. And we have banks preying on us. We also have them flooding our communities the only few spots we can find refuge, right, and shelter with drugs so that we can never know peace. That's important because these things aren't done on accident. The reason why they implement these things is because they know they work. A book I recommend is The History of White People by a Black historian, a sister named Nell Irvin Painter. Read that book because they practiced on each other for a very long time and refined it, wrote it down and say, hey, we oppressed this other group of crackers like this. This is where we failed, but this is where it worked. Expand on this and then pass the baton. And for years and created science and strategy out of this until they finally can export it to the global South in which we live in today. The consequences of racial targeted subprime lending continue to accumulate. As the housing bubble collapsed, African American homeownership rates fell much more than white rates. Families no longer qualify for a conventional mortgage if they previously defaulted when they were unable to make exorbitant loan payments. For these families, the contract buying system of the 1960s is now making its return. Some of the same firms that exploited African Americans in the subprime crisis are now reselling foreclosed properties to low and moderate income households at high interest rates with high down payments, with no equity accumulated until the contract period has ended, and with eviction possible after a single missed payment. That's important because I have seen like ads over the years, like ads in areas that are heavily Black populated about like us taking foreclosed homes, but not taking it, but paying for it at way more than what it's even worth. And not only that, a lot of people default on loans because they find out that trying to fix up these foreclosed homes is just too out the pocket. But how they would propagandize this is they would say like, oh man, I made buku money off of flipping homes. And like nowadays you can cut on, HDTV and see like home flipping and like, damn, they made that much money. No, that shit is bullshit so that we can buy into it. And we can say, well, if we didn't make that much money, it's our own doing. We failed. And that's not the case. I want to urge people that as you learn about how housing operates today, that market, that we will, I'm about to use a horrible word, delineate from that. And the reason why I say that is there's alternative options that I hope to go over in some spaces. One, you should be squatting, and I will explain why at other stuff. But yes, there are so many abandoned homes that we should be taking over and repurposing for the community and defend it from the state trying to take it back. And that's how we should approach housing and shelter. But we have to rethink a lot of things. But again, as we read this book, I hope that we understand why it's necessary. Sorry, I lost my place because I'll be going the fuck off. Some of the same firms that exploited African Americans in subprime crisis are now reselling foreclosed properties to low and moderate income households at high interest rates with high down payments with no equity accumulated until the contract period has ended, and with eviction possible after a single missed payment. By failing to ensure that banks fulfill the public purpose for which they were chartered, regulators shared responsibility for reverse redlining of African American communities. When federal and state regulatory agencies chartered banks and thrift institutions whose unhidden policy was racial discrimination, the agencies themselves defaulted on their constitutional obligations. So that's into chapter 7. I hope y'all got something from it. Again, the space is recorded so people who don't have the leisure time that's been stolen by capitalism to be able to read the hard copy can just press play whenever, anytime, any place. So the next chapter is 8. It's called Local Tactics. And again, that will be recorded too. And yeah, I hope to do a lot more of these spaces, a lot more of these books. Just real quick, the next book I want to do is called, because Miss Crit actually recommended this to be the first book, The Color of Law, and she was absolutely right. The next is called The Color of Money. It says Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And that one, and I have just a list of books, y'all. It's just, I'm a whole nerd. But yeah, so I hope y'all enjoyed it. Be easy. And again, the only conclusion is revolution.